Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Growth Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Dixon, and today we've got Greg Stein on the podcast. He is the founder and CEO of a company called Shadowbox. It's a really interesting concept. So they are essentially creating a web browser using air quotes for the healthcare system so that your doctor can purchase or get labs created for you in a very seamless process, essentially effectively removing the need for a fax machine, which he says that 9 out of 10 doctors' offices still use a fax machine due to a lot of regulations. But super fascinating episode about his journey into being an entrepreneur. He started in his career in actual being on Capitol Hill in DC. So we talk about his career in politics and how that has helped him kind of as he started his entrepreneurial journey. So really fascinating episode with Greg. So let's get him on the pod. Interested in hearing conversations with private equity leaders, CEOs of private equity-backed companies, and startup entrepreneurs where they share their stories about their career journeys, starting, investing in, and scaling successful businesses, and the important role that having the right talent plays in building a successful business, then you are in the right place. Welcome back to another episode of the Growth Capital Podcast. Here's your host, Justin Dixon. All right, Greg, thank you for being a guest on the podcast, man.
Hey, thanks for having me here, Justin.
Awesome. Well, let's jump in and kind of give a little bit of a high-level overview of kind of where you are, who you are, and kind of what you're up to right now.
Well, thanks again for letting me participate in this conversation today. I really enjoy meeting and speaking with and networking with people who are involved in startups and are involved in the entrepreneurial community. I've been a lifelong entrepreneur. I actually started my first business when I was, 10, 11 years old. Take my allowance and ride up to the corner store and buy a pack of gum and then ride back to my house and sell it to all my friends and neighbors and family. And it was a pretty good business. I had a big sack of change and it was going smoothly until my sister decided my prices were too high and went to my mom and she implemented price controls. And that sent me down a deep, dark path of getting involved in public policy and ultimately led to my first career working on Capitol Hill for a couple of legislators. But today, many years later, I am the founder, CEO, and a board member of Shadowbox. Shadowbox, its genesis came out of my experience working with a startup diagnostic laboratory in the healthcare space. By diagnostic laboratory, what I mean is a laboratory that receives specimens from individuals and then runs tests against those specimens for some clinical purpose and then provides a result back to the ordering doctor so that they can provide the right treatment. And so my experience there and my role there was around strategy, dealing with high-level, large-scale type challenges that couldn't be solved with an existing product or service. And that led me to what ultimately became Shadowbox. The challenge that I identified that we dealt with at the lab and brought more broadly speaking is around what's called interoperability. And interoperability is, depending on who you ask, anywhere from a $300 billion to a $950 billion problem. It's such a huge problem in healthcare that the Congress passed a law a few years back called the 21st Century Cures Act, which required healthcare vendors to enable other healthcare vendors to access patient data in a secure, compliant way and put in force some provisions that prevented them from or enforced those rules through both carrots and sticks. And so identifying the challenge, in other words, interoperability in healthcare and a requirement from the federal government in terms of law and regulation created an opportunity for companies like Shadowbox to create new ways and invent innovative ways to bring interoperability into the marketplace differently than it had been done previously. So that's a long story, but what that means in the terms of what Shadowbox is we've essentially built a browser for healthcare. And so if you think about its standard browser, Chrome, Safari, Edge, the typical browser that you would log into your system of record in the case of healthcare, it's a electronic health record. In a practice, you have an electronic health record, and if you want to order a service, that traditional way of moving data between your system of record and that service would be through a back end, what's called an HL7 integration, which means an EHR vendor and a service provider, their analysts and IT folks are writing code between them to move data back and forth securely. That is the standard practice. It's very expensive. It's very time consuming. And although the industry has evolved to things like APIs and so on, what Shadowbox has done is by creating a browser that is in effect an API. And what we patented is the ability to access data within the EHR and move that data discretely from the EHR or the system of record to any other system of record. We're able to integrate at scale. And so that means that you do an integration with an ancillary service provider like a lab, an imaging center, a surgical center, whoever needs data to our back end. And then a practice can drop a shadow box on their desktop and they're instantly able to order electronically versus the traditional method of utilizing a HL7 integration.
Interesting. There's definitely a lot to unpack from starting your first business at 10 and having your sister kind of put price controls on you all the way up through what you're doing now at Shadowbox. I guess for me as a layperson for the kind of healthcare space, and I always find it interesting that my cat's veterinary information is able to transfer data from one vet to an emergency care in a lot speedier sense than any doctor that I've ever been to. So I find it odd that veterinary services are, super well connected, and my electronic health records. If I don't, I've got to fax people things still, and I don't understand how that still works. So, but for your purposes of Shadowbox, so essentially, my doctor could have a Shadowbox browser, so to speak, on their computer, and if they need to order a lab or some type of service for me, they could do that through your system, and it saves them time and probably money because they don't have to work with other vendors. Is that kind of a very simplified version of how it works, or maybe I'm thinking about it wrong?
No, a very simplified version. That's exactly right. So, and you're also right about the faxes. And in fact, today, 9 out of 10 clinics, like your doctor that you go see, when they order a service, they're still using a fax machine. Part of that is also regulatory in nature because what's called HIPAA, the big privacy rule, has said that you can't send electronic information via email, but you can send it via fax. And so sending your health information via fax becomes a default when those otherwise expensive and time-consuming integrations aren't feasible. And so that's why that still happens. And Shadowbox is the solution for that because they can click a button, it extracts diagnostic information, demographic information, insurance information, and enables that to go in a discrete fashion into that ancillary service so that they can perform a good clinical service, send a report back, and then of course get paid for it, which is a huge challenge.
Yeah. So essentially your version is a better fax machine that is more secure and kind of gets around the HIPAA regulations around not sharing or electronically transferring sensitive data. Is that kind of how it works? It kind of just kind of scrapes all the stuff that they don't want to be shared electronically?
I think the best way to respond to that is that because HIPAA has a whole set of requirements about how information can be shared, what information can be shared, what information cannot be shared. What we enable is the movement of only the specific information that is necessary to perform a clinical activity and then provide that back. And it's different than a fax because what a fax does is it may be able to send information, whether it's flat or in a PDF format, what have you. But once that information arrives at wherever it needs to go, its destination, needs to be converted or translated into information that a system of record at the service provider can actually ingest and utilize. And what Shadowbox does is it eliminates that. And so it really does several things along the way. One is it enables the ordering clinician to provide the appropriate information called ask at order entry questions. In other words, questions that are necessary to be asked at the time of order that reflect the desire or medical necessity of ordering that particular test. And a fax doesn't allow for that type of flexibility. The second thing is the way it's set up is it enables the service provider to have customized and discrete forms that are enabling them to provide, not only require the information that they need to provide the clinical result, but also require the information they need in order to get paid for it on the back end. And faxes can't accomplish that either.
Got it. Interesting. Yeah, I definitely I could get deep in a rabbit hole here that may get technical, but obviously that's not the point of this whole conversation. So I want to kind of start at the beginning, right? So but after your first venture selling candies, you mentioned you kind of like started your career on Capitol Hill. I'm kind of curious, kind of how that came about, and so it's kind of a two question: how you got into the political landscape, like how did that kind of was that kind of something you heard about or learned about or saw other people doing? So I'm kind of curious about how it started, but then how has that helped you as a founder? Like, how do you think that your experience on Capitol Hill has helped you or hurt you maybe a little bit, if at all, being a founder?
So the first question, which is how did I get involved in the political landscape, is when I went to college, I studied political science. And my thought at the time was, well, if I'm going to get this degree in political science, which I had a fascination and interest in, I read a lot, love history, very engaged in what was happening in current events. I thought, well, let me at least put this degree to work before I decide what to do with my life. And so I moved to DC, and started applying for jobs on Capitol Hill. Now, I knew nobody. I was nobody. I didn't have connections. I'm not from a super wealthy family. I'm not a political family. But I had worked in technology throughout my time in college. I worked for a desktop publisher. I worked for an on-campus lab. I had this technology background, that because I, quite frankly, was just kind of a computer nerd. And so when I got to Capitol Hill and I started applying for jobs, I found that by sharing that I had this technical background, I was able to actually get my first job as a systems manager, which is the person in a congressional office who helps determine what systems that the office will use to accept, to basically what CRM that the office would use to manage their constituent engagement or their legislation or what have you. And so I was hired initially as a systems manager for a congressman from Arkansas. He was a freshman congressman. And in that instance, when you have a freshman congressman, it's a startup in effect where everything is new and you're putting teams together. You're building solutions, you're building processes, you're building systems and so on. And so from a entrepreneurial standpoint, that started to strike that chord in me, or that fire in me, relit that ember in me, if you will, to be involved in something that is new and starting up. When I started doing that systems manager work, I told the congressman, hey, I'm here and I'm enjoying what I'm doing, but I'm really on Capitol Hill to help make change. The reason I'm here is I believe that there are systemic problems in society and in the world, and Congress is a good place where we could set policy and maybe make some big change. And I was very fortunate that I was able to quickly evolve my role from just systems to also handling legislative work. And I was pleased to work on some really exciting, innovative type things. Ended up working for a different congressman, and ended up becoming his chief of staff in the district, and at a very young age, where we got to work on a lot of, again, interesting policy. At that time, Congress had actually worked with the president, not like what we're doing today, where there's a lot of more friction. And they had actually passed. We had a budget surplus for those years. We did some massive reform work. There was a lot of interesting things. The most exciting thing that I worked on at the time was the Telecom Reform Act. This is 96, so I'm dating myself. But the activity at the time and that legislation at the time really set the stage for where we are today in terms of the internet, and in terms of the ability to really drive innovation within the digital sphere. And so that was an exciting thing. But what I realized along the way, especially when I was that district chief of staff, was that as much fun as I was having within, and as much I felt like I was making accomplishments within the political sphere, I had this opportunity to meet entrepreneurs every day who were doing really interesting things in real time. And so that is what sort of started my transition out of the political world, policy world, and into what I'm doing today. And so to answer your question specifically, I felt that the opportunity to work within the political sphere in an entrepreneurial office was certainly helpful. To work within an organization where you had to debate ideas And sometimes your idea wasn't accepted, and you had to run with whatever the idea was, but you were free to bring ideas. That also helped with the entrepreneurial opportunity. And maybe the third thing, just to try and keep it concise, is the introduction and the interaction with entrepreneurs who are really doing real things in real time and inspiring me to say, hey, I can be a part of that community.
Got it. That's interesting. And yeah, I don't know anything about the political landscape as far as like how, how it is to work for a freshman congressman. It sounds like that is similar to, a startup because I'm assuming as a freshman, you're kind of new, right? And you're kind of like just starting out. And so you have to be scrappy. You don't have the big budgets that a well-known person may have, I would imagine. And similar to a startup where you have to, roll up your sleeves and everybody kind of pitches in to, drive towards a common cause. And I guess as you talk about the interaction of politics or your political kind of position plus the entrepreneurial side, like how does that work? Like, again, I'm not as familiar. So I guess, are you interacting with entrepreneurs in the state or district that your congressman person that you're working with is aligned to, and so you're helping them to or supporting them as they are driving down their entrepreneurial journey? Or can you kind of talk about that a little bit, because I'm fascinated kind of how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So, from the congressional office in Washington point of view, whenever policies are being debated or discussed, people will come from the outside saying, hey, this is how this affects me, or this is a challenge I have. Can we change a policy? And so there's sort of an inbound, right? During the telecom era, we had everybody from wireless service providers. This is again back in the day before we had smartphones and things, but you had the regional Bell operating companies. They had a point of view. You had cable companies with a point of view. You had even electricity providers, utilities with a point of view as to how data or what we might imagine the infrastructure, the legislative regulatory infrastructure would be in the future. So that's the inbound. When I moved back out to the district and became a district chief of staff, it was more about understanding what was happening within our community so that we could be able to better represent that community in Congress. The beauty of the House of Representatives is that you have a smaller group of people that you represent. You can become very close to what the issues are sort of within the four walls of your district and how that relates to the bigger policy on a national level. And so part of my job was to just go out. And so this is the outbound, go out into the community and meet people who were involved in whatever the industries or communities were. And some of it was, I spent a lot of time just in community planning groups and we're going to build this building or not build this building, which isn't a federal issue, but understanding that community. But they're building this building because the biotech community in San Diego is just explosively growing and we need more lab space. Oh, that's interesting. I need to go talk to biotech leaders and understand what's happening in that industry. And we're able, because of that relationship, to more effectively then feed that information back to Washington as those types of issues come up. I'll give you one example. In San Diego, at the time I was a district chief of staff, there was a company, a small startup biotech company that had created the first cocktail of drugs to address to keep the viral load for AIDS from becoming deadly. In other words, it was the first maintenance drug to prolong life for people who had HIV. And they had a challenge because they were ready to go to market, but they had a source of chemicals that they needed to bring from overseas that were subject to significant tariffs. And so we were able to hear what they were saying, understand the public health and public policy objective of what they were trying to achieve by bringing the first HIV cocktail drug to market. And we were able to write into a piece of legislation an exemption for the tariffs on those base chemicals they needed to import so they could go to market faster. And as a startup, every startup out here listening to this is going to understand, we were able to save, I think the number was $8 million in tariffs, which enabled them to really drive their go-to-market. And fortunately for them, they were ultimately acquired by a larger pharmaceutical company. But that's the kind of really specific type of issue or understanding of an issue that we were able to affect at the federal level, which is the opposite of what's happening when you're setting national policy, right? And that's that connect.
Interesting. That's a very fascinating story and one that's very relevant. We're recording this in mid-March 2025, and tariffs are pretty much at the tip of everybody's tongue, in a lot of conversations. So that's really fascinating how that specific, story is kind of relevant today. I'm curious about kind of the startup landscape as you see it, right? So you've interacted with startups from on the policy side and political side, and obviously now you're an entrepreneur, and I'm sure you also interact with other entrepreneurs and founders. Maybe talk a little about the similarities or differences between being a startup and the people you talk to in the startup world, back in the 90s when you were in the politics versus kind of what you're seeing now. And then maybe share a little bit about kind of what you think is kind of, going to push or kind of be a headwind or a tailwind for startups in 2025.
One of the things that I think has really dramatically changed or improved is the communal organization around supporting startups. When I was early in my career, there was an organization that came out of UC San Diego, my undergrad alma mater, called Connect, which was one of the first organizations that was designed to support the entrepreneurial community. And what they did was they brought people with either startup or just corporate experience as advisors to meet with entrepreneurs to help them develop their business models, their pitch, and so on. And ultimately, that has grown into an organization. It's now the San Diego Venture Group Connect. They merged with the San Diego Venture Group, and now they bring together hundreds of VCs into interactions with startups. They're still helping those startups really develop their pitches and their business models and really understand whether or not they as individual founders or their teams are ready to get funded, or if they are, or quite frankly, if their ideas have some legs. And so that type of a community has really grown up, and I see it more everywhere. And Austin, where you're at, a huge startup entrepreneurial community where entrepreneurs are interacting with it. This podcast is an example of the kind of community that's grown up. That didn't exist back in the mid 90s, when early in my career. And so from that perspective, I think that there is now an opportunity for people who have good ideas, or they just have that spirit to want to do something on their own, that there is a community that can support them. And I think that's wonderful. At the same time, I'm concerned that the venture capital community itself is so. I'm concerned that the venture capital community itself has a bit of a follow the leader type of a mantra today, where when I first started Shadowbox, if I didn't include the word blockchain in my pitch, I didn't get a second call. Today, if you don't include Gen AI in your pitch, you're not getting a second call.
Yeah.
And my concern about that is that the whole point of why, and back to my policy days, why Congress has supported the carried interest tax, opportunity, meaning that you don't get taxed on the interest you're earning or in a fund as income. It's the purpose of this type of federal tax support was to encourage venture capitalists to build funds to invest in things that are back of the napkin ideas, or they are off the charts, off the wall, out there to take a risk. And I feel like today the venture community spends quite a bit of time behind their spreadsheets and less time thinking about what's off the charts and off the wall and and back of the envelope. And I actually had a conversation recently with a large venture firm, a principal there, and I said, "What do you ever fund these back of the these kinds of back of the napkin ideas?" And his response is, "Well, if you had $100 million exit before, I might listen to you, but not today."
Got it. Yeah, I'm part of an angel investing group here in Austin, and even for us, like we have people that we host office hours, it's almost like a speed dating for founders or entrepreneurs here in Austin, and we have people come in and their businesses can literally be an idea that they want to bounce off of an angel, or they can be full fledged businesses that they're raising their seed round or something, and so they're asking more about how to pitch better or whatever the case is. And even for us as angels, we're typically very, very early investors, right? And so, we do tend to invest in things that are not fully baked, but we still want to see traction. We still need to see some type of, MVP out in the market, some type of beta users, et cetera. So I don't know who is actually doing a lot of I have this crazy idea. I need some capital. Who's going to fund me to do that? Yeah, I'm guessing that was a maybe more abundant or different back in early days, and now to your point, VCs are not as open to that, I guess. But that also probably drives into the incubator space, right? If you have an idea, there are a lot of these accelerators and incubators now that will help you along that kind of taking your idea from your brain to paper to an MVP and all of that, which then VCs would then invest in that. So it's interesting, kind of how that maybe has shifted over the years. We do in the angel investing group I'm in. We do tend to see a lot of health tech, healthcare, med device startups come through, and I'm just curious, kind of the challenges that you see in that world as a startup, right? I mean, it's a very regulated industry, so starting a business, I would imagine, has a little bit higher risk or more hurdles that you have to jump over than starting, an app that helps you schedule interviews or meetings or something that's somewhat simple. Like what challenges do you specifically, have to face when you're investing or starting businesses in the healthcare space?
It's a fantastic question. And in fact, I listened to a podcast as an A16Z host with Mark Cuban talking about his attempt to disrupt the essentially PBM, the pharmaceutical space. And the question that I found most interesting was at the end was from the host was, Mark, do you believe you have to be a billionaire to disrupt healthcare? And his response was, yes, I think you do. And whereas my response is, no, you don't have to be a billionaire, but you do have to be properly capitalized. You do have to be really enmeshed in the environment and understand the environment that you're trying to disrupt. That you can't just come in as maybe a prop tech or a fintech or what have you, and then port that over to and assume that you'll have the same adoption or the same opportunity as if you really have to come from that background and speak the language and understand the regulatory requirements. And I think that that's what has been our competitive advantage in this place is that we understand both from the top regulatory legislative all the way through to the operator what the industry is in need of, what the pain points are, what the challenges are, and can design our solution to meet and fit within that framework. At the same time, healthcare is a very slow moving industry. Which, I mean, again, 9 out of 10 doctors still using a fax machine to order a lab test. But I do think that there is an acceleration that is happening finally within the healthcare space. The conversations that we have these days with sort of the entrenched CTOs, CISOs, IT folks within organizations are much more open, much more interested in finding new ways to solve problems. And I believe that part of that is this never-ending pressure between the dollars available to provide services, the cost of the services that are being provided in terms of these incredible innovations that are coming to market, whether it's surgical, surgical robots, or whether it's extremely effective cancer medications, or whatever it may be, right? And the third component of that is this rapidly aging population, which needs more services per capita. So you have these massive inputs in terms of driving cost, whereas the dollars available on a per capita basis are going down. And so that is driving, I think, an opportunity for innovation in healthcare that we've just never experienced over the last, at least in my lifetime.
Yeah. Well, talking about innovation, I feel like we have to talk a little bit about AI as it relates to healthcare. To your point earlier, if you don't have the letters AI either on your website or on in your name, VCs aren't going to take a look at you in this day and age. What are you seeing as opportunities from an AI standpoint in the healthcare space, and how hard is it to actually implement a true AI strategy with healthcare, given the regulations and privacy and all of that?
Where I see healthcare currently being most effectively utilized is within the service providers themselves to help them to operate at the top of their license, so to speak. What I mean by that is we service the imaging space, radiology, and having AI that is able to ride side saddle with a radiologist when they're reviewing their images, a PET CT, an MRI, even an X-ray, and enable them to be able to make sure that they have essentially another set of eyes on that same piece of information, and so they don't miss things, or they're more specific about how they're diagnosing or what they're reporting. That is probably the most interesting and effective and currently utilized aspect of AI that I'm personally seeing in the marketplace. But once you sort of get beyond the service providers, how it's helping them, the areas where AI is becoming really functional and interesting are in these sort of semi-agentic AI type opportunities. There is a company that I'm aware of that will make phone calls on behalf of a practice to an insurance company to have a conversation with another AI agent on the other side on the receiving end to discuss the patient in question and to obtain or exchange information related to that patient's coverage. I mean, as an example of a pretty interesting way for AI to be used in terms of workflow automation. And that's sort of the world we sit in, which is Shadowbox is utilizing AI in order to create scalable, self-healing APIs between electronic health records and other ancillary service providers. And so that type of AI is exciting and interesting. The challenges with AI is that we're still primarily a fee-for-service industry, which means you perform a service and then you get paid for that service. Where does AI fit in terms of being able to manage the overall revenue and versus cost of providing services? So if you're investing heavily in AI, but it's not driving revenue, then there's a problem, there's a disconnect. And so as we hopefully move more and more towards value-based care, where it's the whole person, it's prevention, it's you get paid for success, not for service. Those types of AI tools become much more economically valuable, even though they're already clinically valuable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I never put it together about the fee for service totally, where you're right. If you're investing heavily in an AI strategy, that has to equate to higher dollar, coming out of that, right? So you got to actually be generating more revenue with the investment, which makes a ton of sense. I guess as you think about, the next 12 months for Shadowbox and, where you kind of want to go. So if we were going to record a podcast a year from today, what kind of key things are you targeting for Shadowbox as it continues its journey, as a company?
Probably the number one thing that we are working on is ensuring that our network of customers and our utilizers, the end users of practices, continues to grow. Because there's a network effect of we have more EHRs in our library, we have more service providers in our customer set, we're able to more effectively move data back and forth. And that means a lot of different things internally that probably too boring to talk about here. But what ultimately our objective is, if you think about that at scale, is to enable service providers who are outside of the healthcare space themselves. So now a year from now, maybe a year and a half, I'm talking about the social determinants of health. We're talking about homeless service providers and food kitchens and rehab centers and others that aren't necessarily within the standardized health services community, hospitals and health plans and doctors and surgeries and so on. That entire group of entities are completely outside of the data infrastructure that lives within the healthcare space itself. They don't have the same coding in terms of diagnoses and so on. So information that is entered into a homeless management information system isn't directly translatable or useful for the ER where that person might show up, right? And there's no connectivity. So the opportunity that we believe is that Shadowbox will enable is because we're simply a browser that is downloaded, installed in a couple of minutes, and you're up and running and creating interoperability. Is you could drop a Shadowbox on a HMIS, Homeless Management Information System provider, and Shadowbox will, if authorized and enabled, be able to extract appropriate data and convert that data into codable and readable information that can be then sent to health information exchanges or hospital systems or so on, so that the patient at the end of the day, no matter where they're seeing services, they can have a complete continuum of care of all of the services that they're receiving from wherever they are.
So you're not trying to solve any small problems, right? These are pretty significant, which is exciting. I hate to do this at the end of the episode, but how did you kind of get started with Shadowbox? Like, how did that actually come to fruition? We should have probably talked about this a little earlier, but I'm kind of curious about the transition from kind of working in politics to then, working in another corporate environment to then being like, I want to build this business.
So I was working in this large diagnostic lab. We had thousands of doctors who ordered from us. We had this massive problem where we spent millions of dollars a year on integrations. And there, because of the churn or because of whether or not we had a contract with the insurance companies that happened to manage those patients in that practice, all kinds of reasons, the return on that investment was limited. And so I kept struggling. I had a strategy role. How do we solve this problem in a way that is more effective? We first built a portal, and it was beautiful. It had all this WACMEs and payer policies and all these things that would make it super easy for a doctor to order a lab test from us, except doctors don't like swivel chairing between their EHR and another portal. And so I was actually hiking in the Grand Canyon with my stepbrother one day, and I was sort of just commiserating about this major challenge. And I said, wouldn't it be cool if you had the EHR open on one side of the screen and you had our portal open on the other side of the screen, and you just pressed a button and it moved all the data from one to the other? And he looked at me and said, I know an engineer that has invented something that's a little bit like that. You should meet it. So met the engineer, was absolutely intrigued by what he had built. Took it to the CEO for the lab I worked for, and the CEO said, this looks brilliant, but I'm heading out the door. Don't tell anybody. So try and sell the next guy. And so suddenly that entrepreneurial ember that had been sort of stoked through all of these various things I'd done in my career, the lab I worked at had been a startup lab and was now quite big. And I thought, wait a minute, here's an opportunity for me to actually take a leadership role and help build something from scratch. And so that was the genesis of Shadowbox.
That was a very fortuitous conversation as you're hiking, and the fact that your stepbrother knew somebody that had built something that you literally had, birthed in your brain, which is awesome. And sometimes that happens, right? You need to. I'm a firm believer that if you have an idea, you should put it out in the universe, because sometimes people are thinking the same thing, and you're like, oh, well, they may solve problem that you're not seeing, and vice versa, right? So, a lot of people hold their ideas until they're fully baked in their brain or fully baked, through a business plan. But sometimes you need to just start talking, and ideas will come out, and people are like, "What have you thought about this?" Or, "Hey, you should meet this person." And it's just it's a beautiful thing how things can kind of just be created out of seemingly nothing.
You're 100% correct, Justin. And on top of that, going back to the community of entrepreneurs that has been built in communities like Austin and Seattle and here and San Diego and elsewhere, that ecosystem, that's whenever somebody comes to me and says, I'm thinking about starting my own business, what do you recommend? I'm like, get involved with an ecosystem of people who are trying to solve problems, because you're going to learn from them. You're going to have good ideas, or bad ideas, but you're going to at least feed off each other. And if you have an open mind, if you have that mentality of, hey, the universe may create something, you never know, serendipity works. You might be able to take something that looks like an apple and something else that looks like a banana, and it turns out to be something really important.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, and I'll put myself in this box, including, we have ideas, but we're afraid to share them because we're afraid of them being seen as stupid or why would you think about that? Or that'll never work. But the kind of definition of an entrepreneur is somebody that's willing to take a risk and maybe that risk fails. But, to your point about community, you should, have that safe space where other entrepreneurs are doing stuff, and 8, 9 out of 10 startups fail. So, inevitably maybe your first idea is not the best one, but your second, third idea, maybe the $1 billion idea that you've been chasing. So yeah, I think that community is super helpful, and there's a ton of them both online and in person, which I think is helpful. As we kind of wind this down, this has been a pretty interesting conversation, and we could probably talk for another hour or so, and really peel back the onion on some of these issues. But I want to kind of get to the end here and kind of ask you a 3-pack of questions that I ask every guest. And so the first question is maybe share an influential business book or just book in general, or podcast that you have found that maybe people should listen to.
But interestingly that you're asking that question, because the conversation we were just having about having an open mind and having a belief in serendipity to some set, it reflects on a book that I really enjoy and I'd recommend. It's called Mindset, and it's by Carol Dweck, and it really talks about that the way, if you have a growth mindset, the way you perceive the world creates opportunity. And if you don't have a growth mindset, the way you perceive the world shuts down opportunity. It's a fantastic book, really worth reading.
Got it. No, I hadn't heard of that one. I'll have to check that out. Thank you. So second question here. What is your favorite thing to do outside of work?
I am currently a 2nd degree brown sash in Choi Li Foot Kung Fu. And I started studying Kung Fu at the same time I started Shadowbox. And I did so for multiple reasons. One is obviously just physical exercise and getting outside of the office, so to speak, and doing something that took my mind off of work. But also the other cultural aspects of it, the discipline, and the belief that if I could defend myself in a physical altercation, what can I possibly have to worry about in a boardroom? Yeah. Right? Because people are going to come after you for your ideas, your decisions, your activity, but it created an sort of a confidence in my ability to handle very adverse situations. Obviously, I'm not fighting with my board members, but I have the ability to know that I am capable of just like in Kung Fu. It's not about how aggressive you are; it's about how effective you are in responding to the activity that's happening, being aware of what's happening around you and responding at a level that is appropriate for that situation. So love martial arts overall, and I'm enjoying Kung Fu outside of this.
Well, and also if you are in a board meeting and somebody disagrees with you, you can just kick their ass and bend them to your will. So that's a benefit as well. That's awesome. All right, last question here. Favorite vacation spot?
Well, I live in San Diego, and so it's hard to beat being home. Yeah. But so we, the beaches, the mountains are an hour and a half away. The desert's an hour and a half away. So I have an opportunity to really enjoy the community I live in, and though I've had an opportunity to travel around the world, probably the thing I like most is that airplane ride coming into Lindbergh Field, San Diego International Airport, and being back in this community that I just absolutely adore.
Got it. Yeah, no, we were talking about San Diego in the green room, so to speak, before the episode. So I definitely agree. It's a pretty great place for sure. So awesome. Well, Greg, this has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate you sharing your story. If people want to connect with you, learn more about what you're doing there at Shadowbox, pick your brain about politics or anything like that, what's kind of the best way to get you?
Absolutely open door. So please feel free to do so. You can reach me. I'm on LinkedIn, of course. And you can find Shadowbox at shadowbox.com.
Got it. Awesome. Greg, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I hope you found at least one actionable insight from this episode of the Growth Capital Podcast, your one-stop shop for insights from private equity leaders, CEOs, and startup entrepreneurs on starting, investing in, and scaling successful businesses as well as the role having the right talent plays in growing a successful business. It would be greatly appreciated if you would rate and review this podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and drop us a comment so we can expand the audience of this podcast. Thank you for all your support, and don't forget about upcoming episodes dropping every Tuesday.